Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second of our Jane Austen talks this year at Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. And before I do anything else, can I please ask you to turn off your video and to put yourselves on mute while Mark, our speaker, is talking. But please, please, please put yourselves back to speak and so that we can see you for the questions and answers afterwards. Now, as you all appreciate, it's been very difficult with lockdown giving talks, and we've obviously done a lot of Zoom. But because this has worked very well, and because we've had people from all over, sometimes all over the world, coming and joining us for our Zoom talks, we're almost certainly going to be able to continue to do them. And there's also the possibility, because I know some of you look forward to your tea and cake, as I do, there is the possibility that we will be able to have live people actually there at BRLSI, but watching a Zoom talk on screen, which would allow a lot more people to come in, but would still give us our tea and cake. So you have to watch this space for that. Now, I've asked you about the staying off video and muting yourselves. So it's now a very great pleasure to welcome our speaker. Now, Mark Burgess is actually somebody with two hats. He graduated from the Slade School of Art and he became an illustrator. He was illustrating a lot of children's books, some of them extremely well known. But he also has another hat because he's very computer literate and he designs and produces computer programs. He's also been the official, mark this, the official illustrator for the sequel to The 100 Years Wood, to Christopher Robin, which is really quite an honor. So he must be pretty good. And he's currently working on his own book, which is going to be about the subject he's going to talk of this afternoon. So please, it gives me very great pleasure to welcome Mark this afternoon. And I'm now going to hand over to him.
Thank you very much, Diana, and good afternoon, everybody. The talk this afternoon is about Jane Austen, Schoolteachers, and the Reading Ladies Boarding School. And just to give you an idea, if you don't know how Reading relates to where Jane was living, the map shows Steventon just a bit below the middle and Reading towards the top, and it's about 25 miles. In September 1796, Jane received a letter from her sister Cassandra that caused her a good deal of amusement. When replying, she said that she could have died laughing, as they used to say at school. This is the only direct reference we have from Jane to her and her sister's time at boarding school, and as far as it goes, it suggests that they enjoyed their time there. When Jane came to write Emma, the similarities in her lightly sketched portrait of Mrs. Goddard and her boarding school make it quite likely that she was drawing on her own experience. Jane and Cassandra went off to the Reading Ladies Boarding School at the end of July 1785. Jane was 9 and Cassandra was 12. They were going to join their cousin Jane Cooper, who was already at the school. Cousin Jane's mother had died as a result of the disastrous episode with Mrs. Corley at Southampton a couple of years before, and her father had moved to the nearby village of Sonning, which was in the countryside of his youth. Reading is about 25 miles from Steventon, and the journey would have taken about 3 to 4 hours by carriage. George Austen kept what was called a chariot at this time, a small carriage suitable for up to 3 people, with the driver riding one of the 2 horses, so it seemed reasonable to assume that this is how the girls got to school. The illustration shows a chariot in the middle of the picture with the rider or the postilion, as they were called, on one of the horses at the front. It was basically the same as a post chaise, which was a form of hired carriage, and quite often chariots, when they got a bit old or they were sold by their owners, would be downgraded and become post chariots. Presumably one of their parents would have accompanied them, either their mother in the carriage or their father riding alongside. Schools like to claim that they were in a healthy location. The risks from contagious diseases were real and a major consideration for parents when considering sending their children away. So concern for health would be given prominence in the school prospectus. A prospectus hasn't survived the Reading School, but as an example, here's a brief extract from that of Mrs. Voysey, who kept a school in the Close at Salisbury. Typical of what Jane calls refined nonsense, it is a marvel of verbosity. As early rising hath in every age been esteemed by the most able writers to be highly necessary and conducive to health, Mrs. V. induces her pupils to experience the charming effects thereof by being in school at 6 o'clock in the morning during the summer months, and is extremely happy to add the result has exceeded her most sanguine expectation, illness being almost a stranger at the school. Here we show on the map the north part of the town of Reading, with the Forbury, which was a large open space, and marked on it is the school about in the middle down below, which is right next to the old Abbey Gate, and then on the left is St. Lawrence's Church. The Forbury at Reading, a pleasant open spot on the north edge of the town, was reckoned to be healthy. Several schools were located there. This is the view northwards from the Abbey Gateway. The school would have been immediately on the right here. And this is the view across the River Thames to the hills of Oxfordshire. And that church is St. Peter's of Caversham, the village of Caversham. And just below it, you can see Caversham Bridge across the Thames. Most of what we know about the school comes from the reminiscences of Mary Martha Sherwood. She was born the same year as Jane, but didn't attend the school until she was 16 in 1791. Here you see the front view of the gateway. We've just been sort of standing underneath, looking out towards where we are now. On the left is the school gateway, and there's a sign above it which says a boarding school for young ladies, French and English. The school comprised about 40 girls. The schoolmistress was a middle-aged woman called Mrs. Latournelle. She was helped by her assistant, Miss Pitts, and then there were perhaps 3 other teachers. All the usual subjects were taught: French, English grammar, writing, maths, spelling, history, the use of the globes, drawing, music, needlework, and dancing. For some subjects, such as dancing and writing, or penmanship as it was called, masters would be employed from outside or visit from the boys' grammar school on the other side of the Forbury. Here's a view of the gateway today. Now, it's not as Jane would have known it, because it fell down in 1861. Shortly after, they'd gathered, the town had gathered money for actually renovating it, and it was a bit late, and so it was rebuilding. George Gilbert Scott was given the task of rebuilding it, and this is as it is today. The school main building would have been where, to the left, where you see the modern office block now. Like most schools of the time, there were just the 2 terms a year, with a month's holiday at Christmas and midsummer. During term time, the girls seem to have been allowed a fair amount of freedom outside lessons. There was a large garden, a piano, and plenty of books to keep them amused. This is a view from inside the Abbey gateway. As I said, this isn't precisely as Jane would have known it because it's been rebuilt, but it gives you an idea of the space at least, although probably it would have been divided into separate rooms in Jane's time. But it is nice to visit if you get the chance to go to Reading and have a look. And here are some of the Abbey ruins, which were quite close to the school and are worth looking at as well. Here's another view looking back towards the school gateway, and you can see the main school buildings beyond. And now if we turn round, we're standing at the school gateway, looking down the sort of edge of the Forbury open space, and through the trees there you can just see the tower of St. Lawrence's Church. So this is really the route that the children would have taken every Sunday going to church. In this picture, we're sort of looking back the other way. Straight to the right of the church here is the Forbury, and then on the left of the church, the building which you can see with arched windows is the new town hall, which was built while Jane and Cassandra were at the school. Here's another view of it on the left there. This is the marketplace, which is close to St. Lawrence's Church going the other way. The Forbury was just to the right up at the top where that arcade is. The marketplace is pretty much the same now as it was then, although the buildings have changed, but the feeling of the space is much the same. On the right, the tallest building that you can see there with rows of 3 windows, that was the main offices of the Reading Mercury newspaper, and they also had a circulating library there, and it's quite likely that Jane went there to borrow books. While Jane and Cassandra were at the school, the wonderful pig visited, and here you can see that the pig is answering a question by pointing to cards on the floor. The pig was very, very popular and travelled all round England, so that was quite an event. Here you see the new town hall, or at least this is Bath, but it's very similar to the new town hall at Reading. This is the Bath Assembly, but essentially the interior of the new town hall was the same. And the Reading Town Hall that was built in 1786 is actually still there. It's sort of hidden away within more modern buildings, but the space is the same. And that's worth looking in if you ever get the chance. Dancing, as you can imagine, was a very popular lesson. It was important to engage a dancing master with a reputation, though this had to be of the right sort. In 1771, Mrs. Leiths advertised her school in Winchester and said she had engaged Mr. Burgess, who has lately been introduced by some persons of honour and distinction to all the best families in and about Southampton and Winchester, and has the reputation of being one of the best dancing masters in Europe. But she's also careful to add, N.B., Mr. Burgess is a married man. This is because dancing masters had a bit of a reputation for getting a bit amorous, let's say, with the young ladies sometimes. The dancing master for Reading Ladies' School was Mr. John Daw. Aged 31, he was a native of Reading, the son of dancing master Thomas Daw, who had had a long career. John Daw had been a pupil of Mr. Noverre, one of the foremost dancing masters of the age. It was usual for dancing masters to travel about, and Mr. Daw's practice extended to a radius of about 20 miles. He was clearly sufficiently respected to be appointed master at Eton in February 1785. In 1791, he married a rich widow and moved to Sudborough in Northamptonshire to live the life of a country gentleman. He had an assistant, John Morey, who will have shared the teaching at the Reading Ladies' Boarding School. A good dancing master would be an attraction for the school, but naturally the dancing master liked to have a good list of different schools for his advertisements. This could lead to a conflict of interest. In 1797, when Mr. Morey had moved to Doncaster, he was about to start teaching at Mrs. Irwin's school, while already engaged at Miss Proctor's. Miss Proctor wrote him a stern letter. "I'm informed you have not yet given up your intention of instructing Mrs. Irwin's pupils. I shall only observe that when you begin to teach her ladies, that you no longer attend here." It wasn't unusual for dancing masters to set up their own schools, assisted by their wives. Mr. Morey had married in Reading in 1787, and in 1800 his wife started a school in Doncaster. In her advertisement, she is proud to note that she had received her education in an eminent school near London. It seems quite possible that this was the Reading Ladies' Boarding School. This is a picture of South Parade in Doncaster, and it's very similar now. All the houses are Grade 2 listed, and pretty much all the ones that you see here are still there. I'm not quite sure where Mrs. Morris' school was, but I think it was in part of the building with the columns on the right-hand side. But there are a couple of other schools in the same row, and this was the street where in 1817 Anne Sharp, Jane's friend, was living, quite probably working in one of the schools, because later on she went on to have a school of her own. It was usual for there to be 2 dancing sessions a week, and then monthly public days when visitors could watch the dancing. Here you see a picture of what is probably a public day, with the dancing master playing what was called his kit, a small violin. It was much smaller than an ordinary violin, and the children dancing with various members of the public watching. Once a year would be the dancing master's ball, often held in the town hall. There are no advertisements for 1785 or 86, though in 1785 the town hall was being rebuilt. This wasn't the case in 1786. It seems likely that there were no balls, so probably the dance room at the school was used. This is how Mrs. Sherwood describes a public day. It's from her story, The Fairchild Family, but is clearly about the Reading School. It was time to light the candles, long before Miss Latournelle mustered us and led us down into the dancing room. This was a long, low room, having a parlour at one end of it, and at the other end a kind of hall from which sprang a wide staircase leading to the rooms over the gateway. The balustrades of the staircase still showed some remains of gilding. We were ranged on forms raised one above another at the lowest end of the room, and our master was strutting about the floor, now and then giving us a flourish on his kit, when our youngest governess put her head in at the door and said, "Ladies, are you all ready? You must rise and curtsy low when the company appears, and then sink quietly into your places." She then retreated, and a minute afterwards the door from the parlour was opened, and our eldest governess appeared, ushering in the 4 Mistresses Vaughan, followed by other visitors invited for this grand occasion. There was awful knocking of heels and rustling of long silk trains, and every person looked solemn and very upright. The ladies only stayed to see a few of our best dancers show forth in minuets before tea, and then they withdrew. And as the dancing master, who had always taught Miss Vaughan, was invited to join the tea party, we went into the schoolroom to our suppers and to talk over what we had seen. After a little while, we all returned to the dancing room to be ready for the company, who soon appeared again. We were then called up and arranged to dance cotillions. There was a long tradition in boarding schools of putting on a play. The Reading School was no exception. It was well equipped with painted scenery, and the dancing room could be converted into a theatre with footlights and everything else complete. All that was necessary was to choose a suitable play for young girls to perform. A Search After Happiness, a play by Hannah More, first published in 1773, and originally composed for use in her sister's school in Bristol, is a good example. Mary Russell Mitford, who attended the school in its later manifestation in London, describes the performance. Anne Pitts was still the schoolmistress, so perhaps you will indulge me with this example. The whole school was turned topsy-turvy. Nothing was thought of or talked about but our play. There was an entire pause and intermission of all lessons, a universal holiday. Those who did not act in the drama were wanted to act audience, and the making of paper flowers, the construction of pasteboard trellis work. Just as the company were entering and our orchestra beginning a grand concerto, Pastorella, who had succeeded in taking in her stays till she could scarcely breathe in them, between fright and tight-lacing, fainted away, and water was immediately called for. The gardener, whose ideas appeared to have been rather professional, immediately handed up an enormous watering pot, brim full of the pure element, which the housemaid was carrying to the fainting lady when Miss Jane, darting along with her usual officiousness and more than her usual speed in search of a bottle of smelling salts, threw poor Pastorella's own harp right against the well-loaded housemaid, and housemaid, harp, and watering pot all fell together in the middle of the stage. The crash was startling, and our manager jumped over the footlamps to investigate the cause. She found the sick damsel roused by the shock in time to save her laces, and very wisely engaged in washing off her rouge and relieving her heart by a plentiful shower of tears. Housemaid and harp, too, had been picked up unhurt, but the watering pot was rolling about the stage, and the stage was floated absolutely under water. This is a picture by George Morland, which I'm very fond of, and put it in partly because of that. It's not directly related to the Reading School, but this engraving is by William Ward after a painting by George Morland at the Wallace Collection in London of 1785. And it shows a mother visiting her daughter at boarding school. And the mother is dressed in the black hat on the right-hand side, and one of the school teachers is bringing in her daughter. And it looks like a happy scene superficially, but the daughter is rather hesitant when you look more closely, and the mother has not got up to greet her daughter. The thinking behind this, at the time, there was quite a lot of discussion that parents should take more responsibility for their children's education. And I think quite a few parents used to send their children off to boarding school just really as a way of getting them out of the way. So this painting is illustrating that. Mrs. Latournelle has tended to suffer from Mrs. Sherwood's dismissive assessment of her as only fit for giving out clothes for the wash, making tea, ordering dinner, and in fact doing the work of a housekeeper. But at the time Mrs. Sherwood was at the school, in 1791, Mrs. Latournelle had given up much of the running of the school to her partners, the married couple Anne and Dominique Saint-Quentin. After over 35 years at the school, she was surely happy to play a less active role. Like Mrs. Goddard, Sarah Latournelle had worked hard in her youth. She was born Esther Bell in about 1727, one of 6 children of the Reverend George Bell and his wife Christian. George Bell was something of a career clergyman. He was born in 1684, the son of George Bell, rector of Croft in Yorkshire, and his wife Mary. He attended Richmond School and St John's College, Cambridge. Ordained priest in 1708, he became rector of Croft in 1710 on his father's retirement. A few years later, he had become rector of 2 more parishes, a prebendary of both York and St Paul's, London, and chaplain to the Bishop of London. In 1718, he married Christian Wagstaff, whose father, Thomas Wagstaff, was a bishop of the non-juring Church of England. George Bell was clearly a man of great energy and enthusiasm. With so many responsibilities, he must have spent a good deal of his time travelling between London and Yorkshire. He gave several notable sermons both at London and at York, some of which he published. It's not clear how much time he spent at Croft, though the handsome rectory, which about a century later was the home to the young Lewis Carroll, dates from his time. The parish records are extremely thin for the 1720s and 30s, with no mention of any of the Bell family, except for George Bell himself, who was buried there on the 20th of July, 1734. George Bell's sudden death had a profound effect on his family. He died intestate, and the administration of his estate was granted to a Robert Hilton as principal creditor. So possibly his debts were great, and his widow renounced her right to avoid losing her own assets. The loss of income was to force Christian Bell to work for a living. She settled in London and in 1739 received £20 from the Sons of the Clergy charity upon my taking my daughter Lydia Bell to be my apprentice. Apprenticeship duty records are missing for the year 1739, but it is feasible that Christian was working as a schoolmistress. Clergymen often supplemented their incomes by teaching, as Jane's father was to do, and with 3 of her daughters later becoming school teachers, it must be a real possibility that she was running a small school. A premium of £20 would be in line with records for the profession, and although premiums varied widely for all trades and professions, those for the other likely occupations for a young girl of mantua maker or milliner tended to be rather lower or somewhat higher. Whatever Christian did to make ends meet, she clearly did her best to ensure her 6 equally beloved and dear children got a good start in life. In 1739, her eldest daughter, Martha, married Sacheverell Barnard, a law stationer of Mitre Court, Fleet Street, and in 1740 her son George, aged 17, went to Merton College, Oxford, in preparation for a career in the church. However, Christian Bell did not live to see all her family established. On the 10th of December 1741, she made her will, and by the end of the year she had died. She was buried in the churchyard of St Mary le Strand on the 27th of December. Her funeral expenses, including 6 shillings to the bearers and 5 shillings to the mason, amounted to £4 14 shillings and sixpence. The 3 Bell sisters who became school teachers were Christian, Lydia, and Esther. Christian was the eldest and born about 1721. At some point, perhaps when she was 18, she moved from London to Reading, becoming an assistant teacher to 2 spinster sisters, Elizabeth and Anne Eade, who ran a boarding school for young ladies in the Forbury. Close to St Lawrence's Church at the West End, the school had been going for many years and had established a reputation. In 1740, the rector of St Lawrence's set aside gallery pews for the sisters and their boarders rent-free, as long as either of them should be alive and keep school in the parish. and when Elizabeth E. died in 1745, the town regretted the passing of so celebrated a person, of great parts and judgment, excelling in teaching all curious works. This is a picture of the Abbey Hospitium dormitory. The hospitium was where pilgrims stayed, and the dormitory was where they slept. And when the abbey had ceased to be, it became a school, and it was quite possible that this was the building where the girls' school was first. By this time, Christian Bell had clearly proved her worth, because after Elizabeth's death, she took over the majority of the teaching, and when Anne E. died in 1747, the Reading Mercury was happy to announce that the school will be continued by Mrs. Bell, daughter of a late Reverend clergyman who has officiated there some years, a gentlewoman in every respect qualified for such a trust. 2 weeks later, Christian announced in the newspaper that hers was to be a new regime, whereas it has been objected by the parents and friends of young ladies that during the lives of both the late Mrs. Eads, there were 2 tables, one for parlour boarders and another for the young ladies that were scholars. This is to assure them that for the future no such thing will be done, and if any ladies not scholars shall think fit to board with the said Mrs. Bell, it must be on condition that they dine with the young ladies and that are scholars, she being determined to keep but 1 table and not recede from that rule on any consideration whatsoever. When Mrs. Sherwood was at the school 44 years later, the system was essentially the same. The whole school breakfasted and dined together, with parlour boarders only allowed to drink tea and have supper separately if they wished. Christian worked hard to develop the school. In March 1748, a new notice appeared denying a rumour that she was leaving the boarding school and saying that she was entering into a long lease of the house. Denial of rumours of this sort are so common in the newspapers of the time that perhaps they were invented to encourage interest. In December of the same year, Christian announced that she would be continuing her school after her marriage to Mr. Mapleton of this place. David Mapleton was a 36-year-old grocer with a shop in Busher Row, an alderman of the Reading Corporation, and a person of strict probity and honour. Originally from Odium in Hampshire, he'd moved to Reading in 1727. When aged 14, he was apprenticed to his kinsman, Thomas Mapleton. By the time he married Christian Bell, he'd been widowed twice, with a 5-year-old son, John, by his second wife. David Mapleton and Christian Bell were married at St. Lawrence's Church on the 10th of December, 1748. At some point, Lydia joined her sister at the school as an assistant teacher. She was certainly in Reading by September 1749, when she was a witness to David Mapleton's will, and quite probably before that, as Christian was pregnant. David Mapleton died on the 29th of September and was buried in St. Mary's Church on the 3rd of October 1749. 6 weeks later, on the 17th of November, Christian gave birth to a son, whom she called David. Meanwhile, the third sister, Esther, was in London. On the 2nd of July 1747, she married Peter Hackett at St. Clement Danes Church on the Strand. He was a peruke or wig maker, about 10 years older than Esther, and she was probably his second wife. Initially all went well, and they lived in Chandos Street near Covent Garden for a few years after their marriage. Close to the theatre of Drury Lane, Esther clearly enjoyed life in the area, as later she told stories of the green room to her pupils. But by 1756 they had fallen on hard times. On the 2nd of October, Peter Hackett appeared for a settlement examination by the parish of St. Martin in the Fields, destitute of lodging. Hackett is a common name in London at this time, but it is clear that this is Esther's husband, as he declared that he was married to his present wife Esther at St. Clement's Church about 9 years ago, by whom he hath one child living, to wit Martha, aged 8 years and upwards, now in the charity school in Hungerford Market. And this is Hungerford Market here, and the charity school was on the first floor. 3 days later, the parish overseers noted that he was given a pair of new shoes and stockings. Esther was now working in Reading as a French teacher at her sister's school. On the 19th of April 1756, a notice had appeared in the Reading Mercury announcing that Mrs. Mapleton, having engaged a French teacher in her school for the better convenience of those that choose to learn that language, thought proper to take this public method of acquainting her friends, as a personal application this time is impracticable. Although this doesn't mention Esther by name, the date fits so perfectly with her later assertion of having worked at the school for 27 years as to make the identification near to certain. That this was the time she adopted the name of Sarah Latournelle on the suggestion of her employers also seems very likely. And the reason for choosing that particular name is not hard to find. At this time, a clergyman of Huguenot descent called Francis Latournelle was master of a boarding school for young ladies in Kensington Square. It's possible that Esther knew him, but not essential. His name had appeared prominently in a French language primer published the previous year as one of the many teachers endorsing its usefulness. The book was a great success, going through many editions and remaining popular well into the 19th century. With a young daughter and husband in London, Esther presumably made regular visits to Reading to teach for a day or two at a time. As the journey of about 7 hours cost 7 shillings by stagecoach, or half price for outside passengers, this represented quite an investment of time and money, but clearly it was necessary in the family's straitened circumstances. Possibly Esther also worked as a teacher elsewhere, but if so, that remains to be discovered. Regular travel was not without risks. Carriage accidents were not infrequent. Perhaps Esther's cork leg, as Mrs. Sherwood called it, was the result of such an accident, though it would have been a wooden leg and not literally made of cork. They were so called as the best wooden legs were made in Cork Street, London. The school in the Forbury thrived. In 1756, Christian could afford to pay £100 for her stepson John to be apprenticed to Thomas Spicer, a haberdasher in London and a relative of John Spicer, master of Reading Grammar School and a neighbour in the Forbury. In 1763, a similar amount was paid for her son David to be apprenticed to Charles Maxwell, a London apothecary. David Mapleton would go on to be a successful apothecary surgeon, first in Henley-on-Thames and then later in Bath, where Jane Austen knew his daughters. In the early 1760s, Lydia became a partner with her sister. About this time, Christian and Lydia decided to move to the larger premises beside the old Abbey gateway. On the 30th of May 1768, Lydia married William Spencer, organist of St. Lawrence. But by 1769, the hard work had taken its toll on Christian's health, and she felt it was time to retire. On the 15th of September 1769, Lydia announced that she was taking over the whole running of the school, and as her whole time will be given up to it, and the utmost exertion of her abilities employed in it, she hoped her conduct on all accounts will entitle her to the countenance and favour of the public, which she now solicits. There's a slightly plaintive note to this. The advertisement appeared 4 times over the next weeks, so perhaps interest in the school had declined along with Mrs. Mapleton's health. Esther seems still to have had a base in London. In August 1771, she was described as a widow and of the parish of St. Giles in the Fields. It's not certain what had happened to her husband, though he is probably the Peter Hackett who spent brief periods in the St. Martin in the Fields workhouse during the 1760s. The picture is actually of St. James workhouse, but it gives a good idea of what this is actually the woman's workroom, but what an average workhouse would be like, which in the 18th century had not acquired the rather awful reputation that workhouses had during the Victorian era. They were more like clinics or places where people could go to get medicines or to rest, and you weren't in any way locked up or stopped from leaving. On the 12th of November 1767, a Peter Hackett, aged 60 and of Hungerford Market, was buried at St. Martin in the Fields on a note from the parish overseers. Although the name is spelt with a G, this is quite likely to have been Esther's husband. Esther's daughter, Martha, married Richard Ree, a gardener, at St. Mary Lambeth on the 3rd of August 1773. With her daughter married and her husband dead, this was probably the time Esther settled permanently in Reading. By a strange coincidence, there was another Mrs. Latournelle living in Reading in the same parish of St. Lawrence at this time. Perhaps the fact that Esther seems to have always used two words for her assumed name, Latournelle, including an unnecessary apostrophe, is indicative of this rather awkward fact. Mrs. Anne Latournelle was the widow of the very same Reverend Francis Latournelle who had inspired Esther's choice of name. Widowed in 1765, she had come to Reading a year or two later, perhaps at the suggestion of John Coates, a London watchmaker and possible friend of Anne's brother-in-law, Daniel Paye, also a watchmaker. What is certain is that Anne was close friends with Coates's son, Charles, and his sister-in-law, Sarah Hawkes. Sarah Hawkes and her husband, James, ran their own boarding school for young ladies at the west end of the Forbury. It would not be surprising if Anne, who had no doubt assisted her husband in his schools, had some role in their school. She spent some time at Somerset Hospital at Froxfield in Wiltshire, a charity for widows of clergymen, but returned to Reading in 1770, where she died in December 1780. In 1775, Christian Mapleton finally succumbed to her long illness, dying on Saturday evening, the 4th of March. 7 years later, Lydia's husband William died. Lydia herself only survived him by a year, dying suddenly on the 12th of February 1783. Esther now took over the whole running of the school, announcing in the Reading Mercury that S. Latournelle humbly solicits the interest of her friends and patronage of the public, with whose assistance she intends continuing the school. She signed the renunciation of her sister's administration as Esther Hackett, but from then on, as the Gentleman's Magazine put it when reporting her death in 1797, her real name was probably known only to a few of her numerous friends. Of her numerous friends, two will perhaps give some indication of her circle. Richard Valpie was the master of the boys' grammar school on the other side of the Forbury. In his youth he had at first wanted a naval career and then to take to the stage, but when he'd gone to call on David Garrick for advice, his courage had failed him on the actor's doorstep. He subsequently studied at Pembroke College, Oxford, and then, following ordination, became second master at Bury St Edmunds School. In 1781, he was appointed headmaster of Reading Grammar School, and by his energy and enthusiasm over the next decade raised the number of pupils from 23 to 120. This picture shows the west side of the Forbury, the other side from the Hospitium dormitory, which we saw in a photograph earlier. That's the building on the far left, just behind the tree. And then the large building in the centre is the master's house, which Valpie had enlarged to, as you see it here, which is in 1816. The main school room was actually underneath the town hall, rather cramped quarters, actually. He was friends with Mrs. Latournelle and championed her school. The sisters of grammar school pupils would sometimes be sent there, and it seems likely that it was Richard Valpie who contributed the obituary to the Gentleman's Magazine when she died. Margaret New, a spinster of a wealthy family from St. Albans, was a long-term friend of the Bell family. She lived for many years in Bath, where she was a patron and later looked after during his final illness, Mrs. Latournelle's brother George. In later life, she lived in Reading. When she died in 1792, she left her old acquaintance Sarah Latournelle £100 and my silver coffee pot. She also left bequests to Mrs. Latournelle's nephew, David Middleton, and 2 of her nieces. Mrs. Latournelle's assistant was Anne Pitts. According to Mrs. Sherwood, she was an orphan who had been placed as a parlour boarder in the school by a rich bachelor uncle. She was in full expectation of being his heiress, but in the event her uncle left everything to his housekeeper. Left without prospects, Mrs. Latournelle subsequently made her a partner in the school. In 1787, Dr. Valpie introduced Dominique Saint-Quentin to the school as a potential French master. The son of an Alsace nobleman, he'd worked in the diplomatic service, but was in reduced circumstances due to gambling. However, he was a natural teacher, and with his help the girls' school thrived. In 1789, he married Anne Pitts, and for a spell all was well. But sadly, Saint-Quentin returned to his gambling, with the result that he squandered the school's assets. Heavily in debt, the school was forced to close, and in March 1794, the whole contents of the house were put up for sale. The Saint-Quentins and Mrs. Latournelle parted company. The Saint-Quentins moved to London, and with the support of their friends, started a new school in Hans Place. Forced again to work, Mrs. Latournelle was at first taken on by Miss Golding in Wallingford, then early in 1795 by Mrs. Darby in Henley-on-Thames. Mrs. Latournelle's reputation was in no way tarnished, as in March the following year Mrs. Darby resigned and Mrs. Latournelle took over the school. She remained there until her death, aged about 70, in October the following year. Jane and Cassandra were only at the Reading Ladies' Boarding School for a year and a half. They were back home for good around the time of Jane's birthday in December 1786. But it is surely significant that it was the very next year that Jane started writing stories and regarded herself as an author. It was perhaps also at the school that she first tried playing the piano. The brief time she spent at school was clearly formative. Hopefully, in due course, further research will reveal more. I'd like to acknowledge my debt to the late Professor Tony Corley, whose work about the Reading Ladies' Boarding School got me started on my own research. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mark. That was really interesting. I've learned lots and lots of things, which is, well, that is really good. I do have one or two questions, but first of all, can we see what other people would like to ask questions before I weigh in with the one or two I've got? Has anybody? Sandra, I can see Penny, Ruddock, Lydia. Hello, you're all very welcome. Barbara Hall, can you all switch on your videos so I can see you? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Oh, good. Oh, there's Betty. Hello, Betty. And Alison. And I can see you, Sandra, waving. The gentleman that I can see here, I can't see your name properly. You were putting in some interesting comments in the chat room about how Jane Austen used her time at school to put in her books. Did you want to ask anything about that?
No, not really. It just seems strange that when Mark was going through how important within the curriculum both dancing was and internal in-house in-school plays were, that some of the most memorable moments within all of Jane Austen's novels are the plays and the dances, and critical engagements and conversations happen while dancing or preparing for the non-existent play in Mansfield Park, for example. And so how Jane would have, we don't know, but doubtless she would have made notes saying, this will be a good vehicle. This will be a good methodology for explaining the relationships between the people who are already fully formed in my mind. I'm just guessing here, of course.
No, I think it's very fair comment.
Wouldn't we like to have her round to ask her?
Yeah, I'm sure she did get a lot of sort of ideas for her books and things from not just her time at school, but probably from the teachers and the girls that she met there. I was very interested to hear that they were being taught maths, Mark. How difficult would the maths have been?
Well, I mean, it was fairly basic, I imagine, mostly for household accounts and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And the other thing I wondered was, were all the ages taught together?
No, the youngest girls would have been taught separately, but it wouldn't. The girls wouldn't have been divided up in quite the way they are in modern schools. So you would have had quite a broad age range, all in the same class, because basically there was just the one schoolroom, and then down one end, Mrs. Latournelle would be with the littlest children, littlest girls, and then up the other end would be the teachers teaching the older girls.
How young was the young? Oh, look, yes, Sandra.
Yes, you were about to ask the question I was going to ask. How young were the youngest girls? And the oldest girls must have been, what, 18? But were the youngest girls, what, 5, 6?
Probably slightly older. I mean, Jane would have been one of the younger ones, I think. There are no definite figures, but I think 7 or 8 would have been the youngest age possible, really.
It's quite interesting that's at 7, or around 7 is the age when boys always used to get sent off to boarding school.
Prep school, you mean? Yes.
Prep school, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Has anybody else? I actually loved your pictures. I thought they were wonderful.
Yes.
And I love the pig. I'd heard about the pig, but I can't believe he was taken around and shown off to different places.
Yes,
incredible.
He got he had an enormous reputation. He's very, very popular, travelled all over the country, apparently.
Yeah, extraordinary. Oh, I've got a question here from Gary Battelle. Oh, hang on. No, it's gone. Where's it gone?
Chat.
Chat. Where's
There's
the
a
chat
chat.
gone?
Is it at your bottom right-hand side?
My bottom
Oh,
right-hand side.
I think probably he's saying he joined late. Is there any way this talk will be reshown, as the bit I caught was really interesting? So it is going to be available, isn't it? This talk is it?
Yes, it's going to be. It's been videoed, so it will be up on our YouTube channel, so people will be able to see it again. I don't know where my chat room's gone. It seems to have. Wait a minute. Let me.
I think if you move.
Oh, here we are. I've got it. No, hang on. I haven't got it. Oh, I can see Gary Battelle down there. Then, do you want to put your question, Gary, back into the chat room?
I think he says thanks for responding. If you.
Oh, he's gone, has he?
Diana,
right.
I think if you press Alt and H on your keyboard, you should get the chat.
I have got. Oh, it has been answered. Right, I've got a.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
right. Okay. I think I've got it now. Does anybody else
Yes.
have a question? Yes, Jay.
Joy.
Hi. Hello.
It's Joy.
Joy.
Going back to the question of maths, I don't know any more than anyone else about maths in school, but if you look at the adverts for the almanacs, which the ladies used to buy at the beginning of each year, they would have mathematical puzzles in them.
Oh, really?
I have read ladies' diaries where they've been working on their maths or their, whatever they termed, not arithmetic, maths.
Yes.
So
yes.
It was something that women were interested in.
Yes.
Perhaps not at school age. We don't know, do we?
No. Well, I suppose they did have. I mean, Jane Austen kept meticulous accounts of her housekeeping and expenditure and everything. So she would have had to be able to at least add up and subtract and multiply.
Yes.
So
I think these were more complicated questions. You know, more of the algebra and things that perhaps we struggled with. Ladies of that time found intriguing and interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe they did. I was chucked out of the maths class, so I can't judge.
Oh dear.
Mark, when I looked while you were talking online at the price of sending Jane and Cassandra to that school for a year, that was a very, very big commitment.
Yes.
It's like 6 times to 8 times the average worker's wages.
Yes.
I mean, that's phenomenal. Can I assume, is it economics that drove them back?
I think it was, yes. I mean, it's uncertain, but I can't remember precisely when, but about halfway through, they were sort of demoted because originally George Austen had paid for them to be parlour boarders. So given privileges and living separately from the other girls. But later on, he paid less. So it looks as though they became ordinary scholars at that point. And then at the end of 1786, they probably went home for good because they simply couldn't afford it. There had been a disastrous harvest during that year. So that can't have helped the household finances.
No,
Thank you.
I think George Austen actually was, although he was taking in boarders himself, I don't think that it equaled the kind of money that he was having to spend on the 2 girls.
No.
So I think it was just financial.
Yes.
Lydia, is Lydia trying to ask a question?
No, not me.
Not you. Your name keeps being highlighted. What about David Hall? Is that you trying to ask a question? I can't see anybody.
Well, people just
Right, well,
haven't put on their video, have they?
No,
They haven't turned the video on.
Got yourselves
I
on.
can't turn my video on. It won't turn on.
Oh, right. Okay.
So I can't turn it on. So, otherwise, I would have done. However,
have you got a question?
no, I haven't got a question. Oh, here we go. There we go.
I've got another one. You said that Sarah Hackett's son was an apothecary in Bath. I suppose you don't happen to know which apothecary he was at, do you?
You mean her nephew, David Mapleton?
Was it? I thought you said it was her son. Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. But the one that was the apothecary in Bath.
Yes. Now I don't know offhand. He certainly he spent some years in Bath and was quite well known, and his daughters were friends with Jane Austen.
Oh, right. That would be interesting to know. Oh, we'll have to try and get some research on that.
If you hang on, yes, if you look in, if you have the edition of Jane Austen's letters, there's a brief biography in the back by Deirdre Lafay.
Right. Okay. And the other thing. Sorry,
there is a question on chat, Diana, from Ed, who's asking about dancing masters.
Thank you.
Is there any additional reading, Mark, that you could recommend on the lives or professions of being a master during that time period?
I don't know of a general book about it. There is a pamphlet. If you hang on just a minute.
Oh, I can see all the chat now.
Oh, you've got it, have you? Right, yes.
Yeah, I've got all the chat now.
I've got this. Can you see that at all?
Right, Mr. Notebook Academy. Right.
Oh, yes, yes.
It's a pamphlet on a Georgian dancing master in Norwich by Maggie Marsh, and it was published by Norwich City Council. But that, I mean, I did look around when I was researching this, and that really is all there is. I haven't come across any specific studies of dancing masters of the period. There may well be academic journals, but for somebody not connected with a university like me, it's sometimes quite difficult to track those down. But I did find that, if that's of interest.
Hello, Betty. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, can anybody just decide to be a teacher during that period?
There was no sort of particular examination or way where you had to prove your ability. So yes, basically, there were people certainly did apprenticeships, but it was by no means general and it wasn't necessary. But the usual way that people became teachers, particularly women, was that they would go to a school and they would become school teachers when they got old enough. Yeah, basically, right. And often stay in the same school, or they would move elsewhere. So that
a bit like Jane Eyre.
Yes, yes.
Somebody, Gary Battelle, has said you would be a brilliant speaker at the Jane Austen Festival in Bath. You should speak to Jackie Herring.
Thank you.
Joy, did you put your hand up? You're mute. You're mute.
No, I didn't. That was accidental.
That was a mistake, was it? Oh, no, I can see Lydia now. Hi. Hi. Right, and we got any more questions? I do have somebody who wanted to know, Ed wanted to know about dancing masters. There is somebody in Bath who knows an awful lot about the 18th century dancers. His name's Ian Perkins, and I think he's got a website. but if you were interested, you could probably get in touch with him, because he does do a lot of research on dancing. I also wondered what happened to Mrs. Hackett's daughter, Madame de la Tournelle's daughter.
I don't really know beyond the fact that she married a gardener, and I can't remember the dates, I'm afraid, but he did die, and then she married again. But after her second marriage, she becomes very difficult to trace, and I'm not absolutely certain.
It sort of fades, does she?
Yes.
Yes.
There are certainly there's plenty of room for more research, because Mrs. Sherwood mentions a niece called Mary Brown, a niece of Esther's, but I've not identified her at all. No idea where she fits into the thing.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, yeah, there is. Yes, Betty?
I'll ask you a question. So what kind of status would you say these teachers had in the community?
Well, pretty much the same as governesses, if that gives you some idea. They had some status, some more than others. I mean, the sort of people that Mrs. Latournelle mixed with, she clearly was not regarded as in any way beyond the pale, if you like. But not, she wouldn't have been gentry or anything like that. She wouldn't have been regarded as gentry. Does that answer it at all?
Well, it's a bit of a grey area, I think.
Well, it is. I mean, Jane Austen is Jane Austen's fairly rude about school teachers, isn't she? I mean, at one point she says something about who would want to be a school teacher.
Yeah. Well, that was the trouble. That's why Jane Fairfax was desperate to get married, so she didn't have to go and be a governess.
Well, quite. I think probably school teachers were much the same as governesses. There was that grey area where you were neither below stairs nor above stairs in the context of a country house.
That's what Anne Bronte wrote about, wasn't it? When she, Agnes Grey, how she was really quite lonely because she wasn't with the servants, but she certainly wasn't with the family.
Yes.
Yeah. Very difficult. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed that. I really did. I thought that was extremely interesting. And if there aren't any more questions, I'm just going to thank you very, very much, Mark, for giving up so much of your time.
Yeah, thank you.
It really was a very interesting talk. And anybody who missed it, as somebody did miss a bit of it, it will be up on the website, on YouTube. So you will be able to see it again. Anyway, once again, thank you very much indeed. And can I also thank Andreas behind the scenes, who's been letting everybody in and keeping an eye on things. He does all the technical stuff, which I can't possibly do. Anyway, once again, thank you very much indeed, Mark. It was really, really enjoyable.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Well done.